Hello and welcome to my channel Beat Slavery with Racha. Today I will be talking about sex trafficking. What is it and how can we actually know how it happens? Sex trafficking is human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, which is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform these commercial sexual acts is a minor below the age of 18. So whenever we find a minor, as I said, in commercial sexual acts, that minor is a victim automatically. The victims find themselves forced or coerced into a situation of control by the trafficker, and then that makes them dependent on the trafficker, and that's how the trafficker makes them work for them to create that profit. This can include child sex tourism, domestic minor sex trafficking into pornography, and so many other kinds of commercial sexual exploitation. Sex trafficking is one of the biggest criminal businesses in the world. Like the revenue exceeds $100 billion a year. More than 59% of the total number of victims of trafficking are actually trafficked into sexual exploitation, with an estimate of more than 5 million people being trafficked into sex yearly, according to reports. However, it's important to know that these numbers are qualitative, they are not quantitative, because it's hard to obtain accurate information in relation to this crime because of the complexity of it. It's also very important to know that most victims find themselves in coercive or abusive situations from which escape is both difficult and very dangerous, because traffickers use threat towards the safety of the victim itself or their family or friends. So most of the victims detected globally are trafficked for sexual exploitation, although this pattern is not consistent across all regions, which means that in certain regions we see more of trafficking in labor or in sex. However, both women and girls for sexual exploitation trafficking prevails in areas where the victims are detected is in the Americas, in Europe, East Asia, and the Pacific. In Central America and the Caribbean, more girls are detected as victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation, while women are more commonly detected as victims of this form of exploitation in other subregions. But as I said, this information is not conclusive, and it's only about the victims that, like the cases identified. So how does this happen? The profiles of traffickers. This could happen through individual traffickers or groups. Let's talk about the individual traffickers. We have the pimps. So pimps control trafficking victims. This could be a one-person job, which is the pimp. They control the victim physically, psychologically, or emotionally in order to obtain and have control over the victim. So these traffickers would use drugs, emotional tactics, as well as financial means in order to keep the victim in control. In circumstances, they will even resort to various forms of violence, such as gang rape and mental and physical abuse. Traffickers sometimes use offers of marriage, threats, intimidation, brainwashing as means of obtaining victims. And then the stages are as follows. So the grooming is when they make the victim trust them by offering them jobs, making them false promises of love, relationship, making the victim feel like they will be a star or whatever. And then the second step is making the victim dependent on them, and that happens through providing transportation, accommodation, food, all other type of support. And then the last stage is when it's called the seasoning. And that's when they ask the victim to perform the sexual acts. It starts as like a favor, and then it grows in intensity and the frequency of it. So these types of these types of manipulations, let's say, or these steps are used also in when they offer them jobs. And these jobs that are offered to the victims could vary from different industries, like the hospitality, cafes and restaurants, au pairs, babysitters, nail salons, you name it. Other techniques also that traffickers use as pimps is that they actually kidnap the victim and they put them in a situation where it's very dangerous for them to leave. They prey on victims who are lonely or alone or do not have a sense of belonging. So that could be any person traveling alone somewhere they don't know, they're not familiar with, or it could be, teenage runaways. It could be the foster system, and even like girls who would go to the mall. So it could happen anywhere from your neighborhood to even traveling abroad. There are various techniques that are used to restrict the victims, which is taking their access to communication. They punish them, they make them feel that if they do anything that would harm them or harm their families. So sometimes the victims will also find themselves in adhering to the Stockholm syndrome, which is when the captors pretend to be their lovers, offering them care and need, and even as far as promising them marriage with stability, and then these victims would find themselves believing it. And that actually works on the younger ones because they're more vulnerable and less experienced. So in so many cases in different countries, those who traffic young girls into prostitution are often women, which is sad to say, but it's very true. They were trafficked themselves and then they become the traffickers. As adults, they use personal relationships and trust in their villages or origin, like hometown, where they know the girls. They would recruit them and then they would bring them to the country of destination. I know cases like that in Italy where women are trafficking women from Nigeria. So the second type is family or familial trafficking, which is a family member is controlling a child and is trafficking them in exchange for benefits or money. So let's say a mother is trafficking her daughter to, like, exploiting her sexually to her boyfriend in order to get accommodation or drugs. And that happens in the US a lot. It's been reported. These kids do not know that they're being trafficked. It's harder to be detected because they have freedom of mobility. They go to school, extracurricular activities, and it's not really something that's easy to see. So yeah, this form is very prevalent in the US. And now I'm going to talk about the groups. So gang-controlled sex trafficking and pimp-controlled sex trafficking run their operations in a very similar way. The largest difference between both of them is that the pimp is individual, the gang is a group of people working together towards this. So it's kind of more organized. Gangs are now turning into sex trafficking because it's safer, it's easier for them to hide it, it's more lucrative than working with drugs and other means of their operations. So it makes the money quicker. Reselling and selling the bodies of the victims makes more money. And then the more you bring new victims, the more money you make. So that's why some gangs as well would work together and they would create a ring, a sex ring. So that's when you see the stories on the news saying that a sex ring was caught. That's what it means, is that it's gangs working together in order to sell people. They do that because they have access to exchanging the victims among their circles, so their clients can actually have a variety of the victims, and then that would create better profit for them. Another reason that gangs will share females is because this makes it more difficult for law enforcement to keep track of the victims, ultimately preventing them from making a positive identification, and by that the victim would be just being trapped into this ring forever. So when people think of talking about sex trafficking, there's a very big question, which is, where do we find where did the traffickers find people to traffic? And it's not one place, it's everywhere. It could be in the mall, it could be in parties, it could be on campus, it could be in social media. And they always try to find people who are vulnerable, who probably do not have a sense of belonging or kind of feeling lost in their life, trying to find a solution to certain problems like unemployment or a loss of love, or they do not have a safe family environment. So in order for the gang to sex traffic an individual, the first thing they do is that they prey on that vulnerability and they create some sort of a trust. And that trust is being made by showering the victims with a lot of gifts, by showing them attention and love, in order to make that victim trust them. And then by that, they can manipulate them. So let's say, for example, they would take a victim to a fancy restaurant, buy her so many gifts, and then take her to fancy parties where she would mingle with people. And then that's where they would start providing her with a lot of alcohol and drugs. They also learn their weaknesses at the same time, and that's what they prey on, is learning the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities, and then they would spot that, and then that's what they use against the victims. Gang members often wear certain types of clothing or colors, and they would use tattoos to mark their brand, which is the gang brand, and also to mark their victims as property of that specific brand. So nowadays, when we see survivors of sex trafficking, you would see her with a tattoo across her neck or chest or in her arms. So that's the way the gang is branding their victims, to be known across the other gangs to whom it belongs, or they belong. And then the final point is, who could be the profile of victims? It could be anyone who might be going through any type of vulnerability. It goes across socioeconomic levels, backgrounds, ethnic groups. It doesn't necessarily belong to only one group, and that's what makes this crime very lucrative and very hard to prove in courts as well, and very hard to fight and very hard to stop. But however, persons at a higher risk include the homeless, the runaways, youth who are unemployed and seeking employment abroad, people who have been through traumatic experiences in their life, physical or emotional or psychological abuse. Poverty also plays a lot in this. However, that is not necessarily the end point to it, and anyone. So by that, we come to the end of my video for today. I thank you for being here. Please use the comment section below as your Q&A. I will be here to respond to your questions, and stay tuned for more videos and information about human trafficking. Have a good day.